Hello, welcome. My name is Dan, Outreach Librarian, excuse me. It's a little too loud. I'm the Outreach Librarian here at Falvey Memorial Library, and on behalf of the staff and the director of the library, I would like to welcome all of you to today's lecture, the third annual Pope John Paul II Legacy Lecture, entitled John Paul II and the Rescue of Humanism. Our speaker is Richard A. Spinello. He is the Associate Research Professor in Operations, Information, and Strategic Management Department at the Carroll School of Management, Boston College, where he teaches courses on social issues and management, corporate strategy, and through affiliation with the Philosophy Department, Ethics in the Professions. He is also involved in the Capstone program at the College of Arts and Sciences at BC. He earned his AB and his MBA from Boston College, and also holds an MA and PhD from Fordham University. He's the co-editor of Readings in Cyber Ethics, which has gone into second edition, and also Intellectual Property Rights in a Networked World. His work includes numerous articles on, among other topics, business ethics, intellectual property, and the internet. He is the author of Ethical Aspects of Information Technology, Regulating Cyberspace, the Policies and Technologies of Control, Case Studies in Information Technology Ethics, which has also gone into second edition, Cyber Ethics, Morality, Law in Cyberspace, and the book that caught our attention for today's lecture, The Genius of John Paul II, The Great Pope's Moral Vision, published by Sheedon Ward in 2007. About this particular book, Publishers Weekly wrote, "Though beloved for his warmth and charismatic personality, John Paul II was often portrayed in popular media as rigid and narrow-minded when it came to his pronouncements on moral issues." Spinello, Director of Ethics Programs for the Carroll School of Management at Boston College, fiercely challenges that characterization in this overview of the late Pope's moral teachings. About the late Pope and the subject of today's lecture, Professor Spinello wrote, "In his encyclicals and apostolic letters, Pope John Paul II has developed a bold metaphysical Christian humanism. This talk today will explore his grand vision of the human person, truth, and freedom." Please help me to welcome Dr. Rick Spinello.
Thank you, Darren. Let me also thank Ann for inviting me to come here, and thank everyone at the school who had some role in allowing me to speak about John Paul II. Particularly on this day, obviously this is the exact day of the third anniversary of his death, April 2nd in 2005. So it's very appropriate that we gather today and listen to a few words about John Paul II. It's difficult to know where to begin when talking about John Paul II, but since I'm speaking at a university, let me talk a little bit about his experience as a university student. Some of you may be familiar with the details of his life, some of you may not be familiar, but in August 1938, Karol Wojtyła, that was his name before he became Pope, moved to Krakow with his father. He was going to study at the Jagiellonian University. Now, the Jagiellonian University is, like many in Europe, it's quite old, goes all the way back to 1354. This school is old, but it's not that old, right? 1354? No, okay. And it's one of the most distinguished universities of Poland. If you ever get a chance to go to the beautiful, and it is a very beautiful city of Krakow, I recommend that you pay a little visit to the Gothic buildings of the Jagiellonian. It boasts among its alumni Copernicus. Again, just shows you how old this university is. So he arrived in Krakow much the same way you would have arrived here at Villanova to study hard, and his major was Polish literature, philology, and he had plans to be an actor. That was what he wanted to be. That was his aspiration. I don't think he had plans to go to Hollywood, but I think he was thinking about Polish theater, thinking about the stage. And fellow students said that he listened to his lectures very intently, to quote one of them, as if wanting to soak up every word. All right, so he's a model student. Would that we were all model students like John Paul II. However, in September 1939, 1 year later, so he spent a year at the university, we all know the terrible events that happened. World War II began, the German armies invade Poland, And this war, of course, was an unmitigated disaster for Poland. They lost 6 million of their 35 million citizens, and the nation, particularly the northern part, was physically decimated by the Nazis. Young Karol Wojtyła tried to flee Krakow with his father, but as they were fleeing, they realized that the Russians were coming in from the east. You know, the Germans had come in from the west, and they decided that maybe the lesser of two evils was to go back to the city of Krakow, which was now occupied. During these days, and they were very difficult days for him, he witnessed many of his neighbors being taken off to concentration camps. He wrote that life was waiting for bread, scavenging for sugar, and dreaming of coal and books, he said. The university was promptly shut down, it was closed. One of the first things that the Nazi armies did when they moved into Krakow was close the university, because they sought essentially to eviscerate Polish culture. That was a very clear aim of the German government. Karol Wojtyła and his fellow students, therefore, were unable to attend class. The university's closed. But they began to arrange for informal underground meetings with their professors. So they would meet in the professor's apartment and try to keep their particular course going. However, that practice also came to an abrupt end. One day in November 1939, the entire faculty of the Jagiellonian University, now think of how mind-boggling this is, but the whole faculty was invited to a lecture in Suzuki Hall. I don't know, it's a lecture hall, I think, in one of the main buildings. And the lecture was to be given by the head of the SS in Krakow, Herr Müller. 184 faculty members showed up. Some didn't go, very few didn't go. They thought maybe something was amiss. And they were waiting in this lecture hall to hear Herr Müller speak, wondering about, you know, what's he going to talk about? Why does this man want to speak to us? When Herr Müller came in, he was accompanied by SS soldiers. They locked the doors and they arrested all the faculty, the dean, the rector, former deans, former rectors, and they shipped them off to a concentration camp where most of them died. All right, they stayed there, and almost every one of them perished. So an extraordinary event for the faculty of this distinguished university to be carted off to a concentration camp where they languish and eventually die. You can imagine the tremendous impression this would have left on Karol Wojtyła, all of these events. And he began to wonder at this time. Now, he later entered a seminary, and an underground seminary in Poland. He never really was able to finish his education at the Jagiellonian, though he went on and got a graduate degree there. But he wondered, well, how could people be so brutal to each other? How could such systematic dehumanization occur, especially among civilized people? How could the Germans do this to the Poles? We have to remember also that after World War II, the Poles say this is the war they lost twice, because after World War II, Poland was occupied or controlled under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And during those years, I think economic hardships continued. It was a very difficult time, not as bad as being under the Nazis, but it certainly wasn't. The Poles certainly did not have the liberty that they sought and deserved. The Pope later wrote in a memoir, a very good memoir called Gift and Mystery, the two totalitarian systems, in other words, Nazism and communism, I came to know, so to speak, from within. And so it is easy to understand my deep concern for the dignity of every human person and the need to respect human rights, beginning with the right to life. So it's from his experience of these, his intimate experience of these two totalitarian systems, these two brutal systems, that he began to be concerned about fundamentally the right to life and the dignity of the human person. It's no surprise that he, therefore, was concerned about the crisis of contemporary humanism, concerned about the false humanisms that had wrought havoc on the 20th century. If we just look at that century, which witnessed the announcement of the death of God at its inception, we see that when human beings tried to structure civil society and organize the world without God, which is what these governments were trying to do, what are the results? The result of world wars, the result is totalitarianism, the result is places of horror like Auschwitz and Buchenwald and the Gulag. So the fundamental problem in the Pope's eyes is that we esteem man too low. That's the difficulty. That's what leads to, in his mind, to these excesses and to these governments that dehumanize other people. We don't appreciate the grandeur, the incomparable dignity of the human person, because essentially we lack the right anthropology, the right conception of human nature. So we need to get a better understanding of who we are. The Pope was a firm believer that if we could get a better understanding of who we are, then maybe we could avoid these calamities in the future. We need to find a better answer, he says, to the question that is put to us in the inspired words of the 8th Psalm. We'll just read a word or two from the 8th Psalm, but it says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him little less than God and crowned him with glory and honor." So that's the question for the Pope. Question to which he dedicated his entire intellectual career. What is man? He often used the Latin quid est homo. Quid est homo, what is man? Who is man? Who is the human person? In his pre-papal writings, he approached this topic from a philosophical point of view. And his major work was a book, a very difficult book, not terribly well translated into English, called The Acting Person. The main thesis is that we begin to understand the person through his or her actions. He follows the philosophy of St. Thomas and argues that the person is essentially an embodied spirit, a unity of body and soul. That's not our concern. I don't want to give a lecture on the acting person. That would be quite a challenge. It is a very hard book to interpret. I want to talk more about what the Pope, what John Paul II said about the nature of the human person when he becomes Pope. At this stage of his life, he becomes Pope, as you probably know, in 1978. He goes through, is able to survive this terrible occupation of the Nazis in Krakow, and he becomes a priest. Then later is appointed a bishop and a cardinal, and he becomes Pope in 1978. And think about the first encyclical that he wrote when he was Pope. Since the 19th century, almost every Pope had written his inaugural encyclical on the problem of the political order. So it's very customary for popes when they came into office to write about politics, to write about social issues. And when Karol Wojtyła was elected, it would have surprised no one, and he'd done the same thing. In fact, that's what people expected him to do. You know, he was a Polish pope coming from an oppressed section of Europe, still under the thumb of a totalitarian regime. So everyone expected him to write about political ideology, to write about social injustice, maybe even get very specific about the social injustice that the Polish people were still experiencing. But John Paul II's inaugural encyclical, which is called Redemptor Hominis, or the Redeemer of Man, was not written about the state. It wasn't written about politics, it wasn't written about social issues. It was written about the nature of the human person. Again, trying to answer that question, what is man? Who is the human person? And I think the encyclical sends a very strong signal. Popes like to do that with their inaugural encyclical. And it sent a strong signal that social doctrine and theology really presupposes anthropology. So we really have to get this right. It's very important for the Church to work out and to think through its anthropology, its philosophy of the person. The popes in the past really didn't dwell on this issue. I mean, I think they took a lot of it for granted. They were far more worried about pastoral concerns, far more worried about the despotic powers of the modern state. But John Paul II was the first pope to come of age during the early part of the 20th century when the question of human nature really comes to the foreground. Is there a human nature? That's really the question. You know, is there a human nature that transcends the constructions of culture, the constructions of technology, even the constructions of individual subjectivity? In other words, is there a human nature, or is the human person just a construct of technology, a construct of their own subjectivity? This issue is of fundamental importance for the Church. Now, as an answer to the question, John Paul II offers us a very radical Christocentric humanism. And this is what I think he develops in his encyclicals. You could look upon Redemptor Hominis as sort of the preamble. And the other 13 encyclicals really developed this humanism or this anthropology. But I think in order to appreciate the depth of his answer, we have to go back and talk maybe a little bit about these false humanisms that were problematic in the 20th century, and that in his mind gave rise to totalitarianism unwittingly. I mean, I don't think that these humanisms were seeking to do that, but in his mind, they led to these extreme political regimes. The Pope often referred to Sartre and Marx, but I think the key figure behind secular atheistic humanism is really Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. We might think a little bit about what Nietzsche says in the prologue to his probably most famous book, Also sprach Zarathustra, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Prologue, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Nietzsche, but he's a philosopher I don't agree with, but he's a very powerful philosopher. And you get a sense of the power of his very lyrical and poetic prose in this prologue to Zarathustra. It's only about 10 pages long. It's exerted an enormous influence on Western philosophy. And in that prologue, Nietzsche describes a meeting in the forest between the prophet Zarathustra, who's going to be the spokesperson of Nietzsche, and a saint. So this Zarathustra is coming down from the mountains. He's going to preach his message, and he meets a saint. The saint speaks only to God. He doesn't speak to man. Religion for Nietzsche is misanthropic. I mean, the saint is kind of a peculiar figure. It has nothing to do with man. That's the way Nietzsche saw religion. Not the correct way, but that's the way he saw it. And the saint says to Zarathustra, he says, well, don't go to man. Don't go to man. That's worthless. Stay here, he says, and give homage to the Creator. But Zarathustra refuses to pray like the saint, and he wonders why this pious hermit, as he walks away, he says, why hasn't this hermit heard the news that God is dead? How come he doesn't know this? What's he doing praying to God? There's no God. What's he talking about? This formula, God is dead, first announced in Nietzsche's other book, Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, or The Gay Science, captures the withering away of faith, the loss of belief in the divine, the fact that religion now, here in the 19th century when Nietzsche is writing, has simply lost its hold on humanity. And this announcement serves as the basis for Zarathustra's preaching. Now that God is dead, we're going to be able to rediscover the nature of who man is. Instead of God, Zarathustra says, we have to concentrate exclusively on man. I think what Zarathustra, when he rejects the saint and he rejects prayer, he's telling us that worship is no longer intelligible. That theological discourse that invokes God or invokes a suprasensible realm, a heaven, or transcendent standards, that's inauthentic, it's outmoded. So if we want to understand who man is, we have to stop talking about all that stuff and just concentrate on man himself or the person himself. And Zarathustra begins to preach about the overman. This is the highest possibility for man. This is the meaning of man is found, and the meaning of the person is found in the overman. The Übermensch, the best translation I think is overman. It's sometimes translated as Superman, but Übermensch is better rendered as overman. This overman is the person who wants to create and overcome himself or herself. This is the great artist. This is the great statesman. This is the great person of science, the philosopher, people like that. That's who Nietzsche had in mind. In his view, God and religion was holding all these people back. And without God, we could get this great burst of creativity. This overman doesn't submit to moral commands, any kind of divine logos. He, in fact, overthrows Christian morality, which, again, in Nietzsche's view, was a great burden for humanity. In this prologue, he describes Christianity as the age of the camel, right? It's the age in which the human person is burdened by these values, these Christian values. They were a great burden for humanity in his mind. Values like humility or moderation. He preferred excess and, strictly not humility. They restrain man from his glory. But the overman, without God, we have this possibility of the overman. He or she is free to break the rules, create new ones, celebrate the world, enjoy life in all its inexhaustible variety. And the overman never casts his eyes or her eyes up to heaven, but always remains faithful to the earth. Nietzsche uses that phrase all the time. We have to remain faithful to the earth. Makes sense because, again, he doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe in transcendent values. And this Overman is the new man. This is the new man. And now, thanks to the death of God, thanks to the demise of religion, the person can be authentically human. Closely related to this. Now, you could see why all of this would be, of concern to the Pope, to anyone in any religious figure. Closely related to Nietzsche's empty view of the person is the negative anthropology of Sartre. In response to that question, quid est homo, Sartre says, man is freedom. The person is freedom. He says, unlike the physical things of the world, the person doesn't have a definable nature. Man's only nature is freedom itself. He's free to make himself, to choose what he wants to be, to define himself. There's no given nature to man. So both for Nietzsche and Sartre, once we overcome traditional definitions of the human person, which are generally tied to religion, we're free to explore these new ways of being human. Now, it sounds very exhilarating, I think, and I think a lot of people were misled, in my opinion, by Nietzsche and Sartre. Now, and let me just make one qualifier here. In case there are any philosophers among you, I realize I'm oversimplifying a bit. They're much more sophisticated than I'm making them out to be. But I think this is the essence of what they were trying to say. Karl Marx is another figure in another one of these false humanisms that I think was of deep concern to the Pope. He sought to reconceive the notion of man according to an atheistic perspective, the same perspective as Nietzsche and Sartre. Marx gave primacy to matter. That's the origin and nature of all things. There's no creative intelligence. There's no spiritual soul. He emphasizes the productive man. It's all about economics. Productive activity determines everything, really. Politics, morality, culture. It all comes forth from our productive activity. Marx, like Nietzsche, seeks the new man. He uses that phrase, the new man, which he calls the socialized man, who will emerge once defective social structures, class systems, free markets is overcome. Now, where are we today with this stuff? I think we still have these false humanisms. But things have gotten even worse. Secular humanism is bad enough, but at least it's humanism. It gives preeminence to the human person. It keeps the human person on his or her pedestal, so at least it's humanism. It recognizes the nobility of the person. It gives the person a place of honor in created reality. But since the time of these philosophers, we've now witnessed the rise of anti-humanism. Repeated attempts to knock man, knock woman off the pedestal. It's become very fashionable in certain circles to deplore the anthropocentric bias of Western philosophy and to argue that the person is not really different in kind from animals. Here's one novelist who writes a lot about these issues. He's a sort of novelist philosopher. Here's how he describes the person. He says, "We are all of us dogs and barnacles, pigeons and crabgrass, the same in the eyes of nature, equally remarkable and equally dispensable." So this view is that, we're all reality is the same. The dog, a crabgrass, a pigeon, a cat, a person, it's all the same thing fundamentally, right? Equally remarkable, equally dispensable. There has even been a movement in recent years to challenge the human-centric tradition in moral philosophy by giving robots, this is the field that I'm very familiar with, giving robots and computers with artificial intelligence some sort of moral standing. Philosophers banging their head against the wall to try to come up with rationales for why a computer would have rights and why a computer with some kind of intelligence would have some kind of accountability. They think that we overemphasize, again, the human person, and they want to get rid of this human-centric bias. So these trends are very disturbing, I think. Despite the horrors of the last century that the Pope witnessed, the crisis of contemporary humanism in some ways has gotten worse. It's intensified. And there's a systematic denial of our unique human worth. All of these interpretations, whether it's Sartre or Nietzsche or anti-humanism, sells the person too short and leaves the value of his humanity really unexplored. So how do we develop or the person? Where do we turn an answer to that question, what is man, quid est homo, that so preoccupied the Pope? Above all, says John, to turn to the gospel. We have to turn to the words of Jesus Christ. In almost every single encyclical that he wrote, he quotes the Vatican II document called Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope. And Gaudium et Spes says in paragraph 22, the truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. In the very revelation of the Father and of his love, fully reveals man to himself and brings to light his most high calling. So it's Jesus Christ who fully reveals man to himself and brings to light his most high calling. It's the exact opposite of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's trying to say if we get rid of God, we can finally understand who the human person is. And John Paul II is saying that the person can never fully understand who he is or who she is without Jesus Christ. Exact opposite positions. Unless we appreciate that we're created by God, that we have a creator, that we're redeemed by his son, Jesus Christ, we're never going to know, we're never going to fully know who we are. We'll have some sense of who we are, but we'll never fully know who we are. We'll never fully come to terms with our identity. I think this notion is, this idea that, essentially if we want the answer to the question of who we are, we go to Jesus Christ, is very typical of the Pope's Christocentric approach to theological issues. He says in the early section of Centesimus Annus, one of his encyclicals on social issues, there can be no solution of the social justice question apart from the gospel. It's a pretty bold statement, If we're going to solve the question of social justice, we have to do it in conjunction with the gospel. But to flesh out Christian anthropology, we have to understand the origins of man. We have to get back and understand the origins of man. The Pope has said this many times, and again, this is a quote from Gaudium et Spes. The creature, you and I, is unintelligible without the Creator. So we have to go back and understand something about creation. In 1976, when he was still a cardinal, Karol Wojtyła was summoned to Rome to give a Lenten retreat to Pope Paul VI. It's customary for the popes to have someone come in and give a retreat. And Pope Paul VI, this was towards the end of his life and towards the end of his reign as pope. And he was old and somewhat frail, but he sat in the sanctuary of the Matilda Chapel. He wore a plain white cassock. Under the cassock was a Lenten hair shirt because it was Lent. And he listened to a series of talks by Karol Wojtyła, who was going to be made pope in 2 years, but was a cardinal at this time. These talks have been gathered in a marvelous book called The Sign of Contradiction. It's a wonderful book. It's a window, really, in some ways, a window onto the papacy of John Paul II, because in that book he really talks about all the key themes of his papacy. It's very well done. It's easy to read. It's one of the easiest things of John Paul II that one could read. It's out of print, unfortunately, though I'm sure this very good library must have copies of it, but I highly recommend it. The title is from Luke's Gospel, part of Simeon's hymn, Behold, he is set for the fall and the rising of many in Israel, and as a sign of contradiction. The idea that Jesus contradiction. And in the sign of contradiction, in one of the early talks that he gave to Pope Paul VI, here's what he says. He says, today, one cannot understand either Sartre or Marx without having first read and pondered very deeply the first three. These are the key to understanding the world of today, both its roots and its extremely radical affirmations and denials. So if we want to understand where Sartre and Marx have gone wrong, if we want to understand again who the human person is and what's going on in the world today, we need to go back to the Genesis, the first 3 chapters of Genesis. That's the clue. There we find perhaps the ingredients to understand ourselves and understand our world. And you'll find that, I know those of you who might be familiar with theology of the body are familiar with the fact that he draws a lot from Genesis when he writes about those particular issues in theology of the body. But even in the encyclicals, he's constantly going back to Genesis and constantly going back to the first 3 books of Genesis. So it's the creation story. That's the key to understanding ourselves. But as David Schindler and other theologians have pointed out, it has to be a Christ-centered theology of creation. In other words, it has to have integrated into it the perspectives of eschatology and the Trinity and redemption. So what do we learn here? If we go back to these first 3 books of Genesis, what do we learn about the nature of the human person? Why is Genesis so revealing? First of all, and I'm taking, he doesn't say this systematically, I'm taking this from different encyclicals. But first of all, we learn in Genesis that the person is made in God's image and likeness, Genesis 1:26. And herein lies the deepest ground of our dignity. But the question is, and the Pope explores this in several of his early encyclicals, how do we image God? It's one thing to say that you and I are made in the image and likeness of God, but how do we image God? Now, we certainly image God through our rationality and freedom. So we're like God because we have reason and free will. In the early encyclicals, he continued to use the language of the acting person, and he referred to the person as transcendence. And that term, for him, captures the person's rational self-determination that sets him or her apart from other creatures and allows him to exercise dominion over the earth, the dominion to which he is called in Genesis. We're free, but remember that freedom for John Paul II is always tied to the truth. There's never a suggestion of support for the notion of absolute freedom of a Sartre or Nietzsche. He said once in one of his Vatican II interventions, there is no liberty without the truth. He said that in 1965, and he's been repeated it ever since until he died in 2005. No freedom, no liberty without the truth. So we image God through our rationality and freedom. More importantly, he says, we image God through our capacity of having a personal relationship with God, as an I and a you. So the content of our imaging of God consists primarily in our innate capacity for God. That's the primary way we image God. We have a capacity for God. We have the capacity for a relationship with God. We image God by becoming sons and daughters in the Son, all right, who cry out to God, Abba, or Father. Every creature, the Pope repeated this many times, every creature is eschatologically destined to fulfillment within the inner life of God. We have the capacity for God, and that's our eschatological destiny. So every person is made for social communion. And the communion of persons here on this earth, which takes place in marriage and family and friendships and so forth, mirrors in some sense our communion with the triune God. Now we should notice that John Paul II puts a great deal of emphasis on our status as relational beings. He tries to overthrow the Enlightenment idea that we're isolated, atomic individuals accidentally related to one another. We're not accidentally related to one another. We are relational. That's our very being, is to be relational. And man, like the Trinitarian God he images, has his unity and his integrity only in relation. The person's unity is ordered to and from community as it uses the Latin term sometimes, communio personarum, a community of persons. So relation is not I do or something I have, it's something I am. So what gives us incomparable dignity is the fact that we've been created out of dust, to use the language of Genesis, and stamped with this divine image. We image God through this capacity to enter into a relationship with other human beings and with God himself. We also image God through these gifts of reason and free will. And we image God through the Son, through Jesus Christ the Son, because like the Son, like Jesus Christ, we are from God and we are predestined for God. Now, despite the fact that we are made a little less than God, despite the fact that we have all this lofty status, right? It's a much higher status. You can see right away it's a much higher status. A person has a much higher status than he does in the thought of Nietzsche or Sartre or Marx or those people. We're still creatures. We still have an ontological and ethical dependence on God, he says. We're not co-creators. I see people use that term sometime, not in reference to him, but they talk about human beings as co-creators. I think you would have trouble with that term. We're creatures. And above all, we're not the source of the moral order. Moral order is not our creation. It's given to us by God for our own good and our own perfection. Moral order is symbolized in Genesis by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve are capable of and limited by moral good and evil. They have a prerogative, they have a command to exercise dominion over the earth, but always, says the Pope, within the Creator's original ordering. So he always qualifies this notion of having dominion and subduing the earth. Now, we can't help but deceive the distinct hierarchy of being in Genesis, right? We have God the Creator, we have the human person, we have animals. Now, this is common sense, but again, a lot of people today, some intellectuals today seem to be trying to overthrow it. The human person is different from God, different from the beasts. I'm not a creator. I'm not the origin of my being. But at the same time, I can't be reduced to the level of the beasts. Animals and creatures don't bear this likeness to God. They don't have a capacity to enter into relationships. They lack this divine imprint. There's an ontological threshold between persons and animals that we can't ignore. The person is simply radically distinct from the rest of the world. As we've discussed, however, different contemporary anthropologies are now attempting to contract the threshold between revelation, to contract that threshold, right? To say that maybe there's not such a big difference between the animal and a human being. But revelation, above all, and to a certain extent experience, teaches us that that threshold is not an arbitrary threshold. Finally, we can't forget about the reality of sin, which also emerges in Genesis. Not a very popular topic today, but what the heck. All right. Theistic views of creation, according to Schindler and again these other theologians who interpret John Paul II, have tended to prioritize man's status as a free intellectual agent. The person's weakness due to sin is sort of seen as something secondary and accidental. But a Christological reading of Genesis, which again integrates the notions or the perspectives of redemption and eschatology, would regard sin as concretely affecting the human person from the beginning, of his or her existence. Every person needs justification and liberation. Excuse me, just 1 second. My voice is caving out. That's what happens to me at the end of a long semester. My students would wish I'd lose my voice, but that hasn't happened yet. Every person needs justification and liberation. So our transcendence, that transcendence we have to appreciate that it's deeply permeated with finitude, our limitations as creatures, and the burdens of original sin. We're not just creatures. That's part of our reality. Again, we're made in God's image, but we have limitations. We're creatures. But the other part of the reality is that we're fallen creatures. And the fall from grace is serious. It's serious stuff. Sometimes we underestimate the depth of the need for forgiveness and liberation that people have. When man sins, when people sin, they undermine their filial relationship with God. The person ruins himself, cuts himself off from his eschatological destiny, the source of his ultimate fulfillment. Now, we've been redeemed by Christ, so we can take advantage of sanctifying graces that liberate us from sin. And once we're liberated from the bondage and the falsehood of sin, then true freedom becomes possible. Freedom to fulfill our supernatural end with the help of God's grace. And for this, the Holy Spirit has come among us. In his wonderful encyclical on the Holy Spirit, he talks about how the Holy Spirit, because sin is such an important thing to understand and to overcome, that one of the reasons the Holy Spirit has been sent, right? When Jesus leaves, the Holy Spirit is sent, and one of the primary reasons is to convince the world, to convince an unconvinced world about the reality and the danger of sin. Now, we've been given a conscience, which is another source of our dignity. Conscience represents the voice of God within us that commands what is good and forbids what is evil. And through conscience, says the Pope, the person, the image of God, can reflect the model. So being made in God's image is a reality, it's an ontological reality, but it's also a challenge, because as an image of God, I have to reflect the model. Jesus Christ is the model. Now, how does the image, you and I, reflect the model? We're all called to act like Christ. It's very simple. And this means that we have to manifest mercy for, as the Pope himself, through a sincere gift of self. In that encyclical on the Holy Spirit, Dominum et Vivificantem, the Pope says that statement, man finds himself through a sincere gift of self, that statement sums up the whole of Christian anthropology. So there's a prescriptive side to this anthropology. We know who we are, ontologically speaking, and we know what we should do. So the bottom line here is that instead of a negative anthropology or a weak anthropology or thin anthropology of the Sartre, the Nietzsche and Marx and that crowd, we have instead a very robust anthropology, a solid anthropology. We know a lot about ourselves just through revelation. We know that we're like Christ. We know that like Christ, we come from God, and communion with God is our destiny. We're not isolated beings. We're ordered for social communion. We have free will. We have an intellect which allows us to enjoy the finite goods of this world and ultimate good in the next world. We're dependent on God. We're creatures, not co-creators, subject to the moral order given to us by God. We're sinners in need of redemption. But God has given us the gift of conscience so that each of us can discern the moral truth and reflect the image to which he has been made, the image of God. By reflecting that image, we become worthy of our destiny, which is union with God. So above all, human dignity, very important concern of the Pope, is defined in terms of the person's capacity and vocation to enjoy communion with God. We are all from God, we come from God, we are for God, and any anthropology that neglects that, that overlooks that, will not esteem man highly enough. Now let me conclude with a few questions. I think now that we understand, I'm going to ask some questions that are just provocative questions, and you can ask me questions if you like, but now that we understand this rather bold Christian humanism, and I think it is a bold Christian humanism because he's basically saying that we can't fully understand ourselves without Jesus Christ. That's a pretty bold statement. What kinds of questions would it raise? How does it challenge us in a certain sense? First of all, what are the pedagogical implications of this vision of Christian humanism, especially for those of us who teach and work at Catholic universities? I would suspect most people are familiar with secular humanism, but most are unfamiliar, probably, with this countercultural conception of the person, and it is a very countercultural, radical conception of who the person is. And I think it's a challenge for Catholic universities to present this version of humanism in a way that respects philosophical pluralism, theological pluralism, but doesn't dilute the substance of John Paul II's teaching. Secondly, it's a more philosophical question, but many of us, including myself, would recognize the merits of existential humanism. We recognize that there's a lot of wisdom in the thought of Sartre and Heidegger and even Nietzsche to some extent. These are just, even though I think their views on the nature of the person are misguided. But they have concern for the human person. They are humanists after all. And I wonder whether their anti-metaphysical humanism, because it is very anti-metaphysical, excludes the possibility of developing an anthropology that really accommodates the dignity of the individual as such. Right? I think John Paul II's anthropology, which includes a metaphysical dimension I really haven't talked about, that works with revelation, beautifully accommodates the dignity of every single person, because we're all fundamentally the same with this divine imprint. I'm not so sure that the same could be said of these philosophies, but again, I raise it as a question. I think any viable version of Christian humanism has to accommodate man's legitimate autonomy and his relation to God. Right? The Pope, unlike some other Christian humanists, gives priority to our relationship to God over freedom. Now, this reordering of priorities suggests, I think, that Christianity and humanism are intrinsically related. All right? They're not accidentally related, they're intrinsically related. It suggests that a humanism that is not Christian is going to be profoundly deficient. Now, I raise this question: is this viewpoint correct? Is there room to doubt this kind of reordering of priorities? I think what cannot be doubted is that John Paul II has laid out a grand vision, a thoroughly Catholic vision of what it means to be a human person. His work is it's a comprehensive attempt to correct these false humanisms that have bedeviled the last century. And he does so by pointing people in one direction, and that direction is Jesus Christ. He alone, the Pope says, can answer our questions about human nature. Again, I think it's very appropriate, as I bring this to a conclusion, it's very appropriate that we gather today and reflect on this theme of anthropology that preoccupied this Pope for so much of his life. He wrote about it from his early days as a philosopher, as a theologian. He wrote about it as Pope. It was so important for him to try to communicate to people the right view of the human person. We remember his life in a special way on this day. Again, it's the 3rd anniversary of his death. His life is over. His long journey, of course, has come to an end, and in his own words, he's gone to the Father's house. But I think his life remains an inspiration and a challenge for all of us. It's an inspiration to bear witness to the truth of the incarnate Word, particularly the truth about the dignity of the human person, and it's a challenge as fearlessly and as full of hope as he did. Thank you. Thank you. If my voice holds out, I think I just caved in at the end there, but if it holds out, I could answer a question or... Question? Yeah.
The presentation was really excellent.
Well, thank you very much.
Especially for, I think, as I am in the sciences rather than in the philosophy, etc. We have very few opportunities to address these questions. In this anti-humanist and the relationship to the animals, etc., how does science figure in that? Because from the scientific point of view, we find so much similarities among the species.
Sure.
Did Pope John ever address the science of this development?
Well, that's a very good question. She's asking about the perspective of science in this anti-humanist perspective. Great deal of respect for science. I think he would say, though, that even though science might give some evidence, that the question is primarily a theological question. We have to turn to Revelation and a philosophical question. In other words, if we're going to make the case that human beings are different in kind from animals, we're probably going to have to go beyond science. We need philosophy, we need metaphysics, we need theology and revelation. So, other questions or yes?
Does that sort of anti-humanist science enrich Christian humanism because it understands the human person as maybe greater than we have traditionally thought of the human person? In other words, you know, if trees are not pollinated by bees, our lives are enriched with that certain fruit, and if we're that kind of broadens what we understand to be human.
Yeah.
There needs some overlap between the anti-humanism, and
Right.
I wonder if that's legitimate.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think in some respects it could be. I mean, I think that there's nothing wrong with elevating our appreciation of the rest of creation and esteeming it highly. But I think what you want to avoid is obviously bringing the human person down to that level. You know, the term used here is the threshold. You want to maintain that threshold. But there's nothing. There's something inspiring about seeing. I mean, all creation is God's work, so we ought to, you know, perhaps esteem it more highly than we do. We ought not to have a instrumentalist view of nature, and there's where maybe some of the humanistic thinking of someone like Heidegger, because that was his big concern, is that he often used the term technicity. We've fallen into this attitude of technicity where we see everything as an instrument. You know, we don't appreciate the grandeur of nature and so forth. So some of what this the false humanisms, the anti-humanism, some of their insights really could, in a way, contribute to a solid Christian humanism. But again, you always want to keep that threshold there, and some people want to eliminate it. Questions? Okay, I guess we're all set. Thank you very much. I appreciate your coming and listening to me.